Hello and welcome to today's Scott Story. I'm Kirsten and thank you for tuning in. And today we're starting our story here in one of Edinburgh's closes, these narrow alleyways which tend to be pretty steep and which make up so much of Edinburgh's old town. Now, Warriston Close behind me here runs parallel to the more famous Mary King's Close. And the name Mary King's Close is one that is familiar to many people who come and visit Edinburgh. It today lies buried underneath building work that took place in the 18th century, so what remains of it is underground. It was named for one of its residents, Mary King, who lived there back in the 17th century and who was a pretty successful woman. She was a cloth merchant and she even became a city burgess, which was an honour not bestowed frequently on women. So a pretty impressive woman herself. However, it is not Mary King that we're going to be focusing on today. Rather, we're going to be focusing on another woman who lived in another of the closes very near to here and who lived a little over a century before Mary King. She too was a successful merchant. However, her story ended up taking something of a dramatic turn. So let's go and find out a little bit more about Alison Rough. Well, I'm standing here in the courtyard of Edinburgh's city chambers, so that's effectively the city hall. And the reason that I'm here is because this is the building that was constructed in the late 18th century on top of Mary King's Close and also on top of Craig's Close. And Craig's Close is somewhere that we believe that Alison spent a few years at least towards the end of her life. Now, if you have heard of Alison Rough, and I'm guessing that there's a good chance that you have not, but if you have heard of her, the thing you probably know about her is that she was a murderer, that she murdered and was then executed in turn. However, to reduce her to this terrible end is to ignore the invaluable light that her life shines for us upon the lives of women in Edinburgh in the early 16th century. Now, Alison Rough, there's an awful lot about her life that we do not know, including when or where she was born, although we believe that it was probably in about 1475. And we also really don't know anything about her childhood. In fact, the first thing we do know about her is her marriage. And she was married to an Edinburgh notary and merchant burgess, Jasper Main. And we know that Jasper met his sad end, as did so many men of fighting age across Scotland in 1513 at the Battle of Flodden. And by the time she was widowed, Alison and Jasper had 4 children, at least 2 sons and 2 daughters. And when she took on leading the household, Alison did as probably many women who were widowed by Flodden and started running her husband's businesses as well. And she couldn't really have become a notary overnight, a legal professional. However, she did seem to have picked up an awful lot of legal knowledge and made many valuable contacts during the time of her and Jasper's marriage. And she certainly did go straight in to becoming a merchant and also took on all of the various property dealings that Jasper had been involved in during his lifetime. So it seems fairly clear that she had been fully involved in all of this during the 15 or so years of their marriage. But it took, as so often it seems to do, it took this time of terrible conflict for the woman's name to actually appear in our history. The reason, however, that we know that bit more about Alison's life is that she appears in numerous court records, both church and secular, either suing or being sued over various property rights and monetary debts. This includes amounts that were owed both to and by her, that she'd inherited from her husband, and later amounts that were due her from her own dealings as a merchant in her own right. She was certainly a formidable woman. She knew her way around the legal system, despite, it seems, having been unable to write. and she was not afraid to use it. Alison spent time working as a cloth merchant off a merchant booth in Anchor Close, which is the street that runs off the Royal Mile just behind me here, and this was probably the same booth that Jasper had traded from before his death. Later, Alison rented this booth to another merchant, and after that it seems that she made most of her income from property rentals. During his lifetime, Jasper and Alison had cleverly ensured that all of his various properties around the city were jointly in her name, which meant that on his death she inherited all of these properties in full, rather than the third of a husband's wealth that usually legally went to a Scottish widow. This led her into disputes, however, some of which she won, some of which she lost, over the land's true ownership, including one over a property here in White Horse Close, down towards the bottom end of the Royal Mile. Now, many of these disputes were ongoing from Jasper's time. However, Alison never shied away from a legal battle. She fought very strongly on her own behalf, but even more so on behalf of her children, each of whom were given various aspects of the family estate as they came of age. So it is incredibly sad that one of the most acrimonious of these disputes was with her own eldest son, John. It appears that John and his wife were keen to obtain more of the family wealth than they were really entitled to, and in order to do this, they went about claiming that John's sister Isabel was illegitimate. Now, this was a claim which, had he won, would have not only compromised Isabel's social standing and her inheritance, but of course would also have had a great impact on Alison's reputation as well. Thankfully, he lost, with Alison fiercely defending her daughter. However, John continued to assert that Alison was not giving him everything that he was entitled to. But Alison was no stranger to assaults on her character. At some point during the decade after Jasper's death, she remarried unsuccessfully. It's an event that we only know about due to the court records of the divorce proceedings. And at the same time that she was going through the divorce, Alison was also at court suing one Margaret Cairns for defamation. Now, we don't know the reasons behind this. However, Professor Elizabeth Ewan of the University of Guelph does have a theory, and the esteemed Professor Ewan, she's really the person that we have to thank for pretty much everything that we know about Alison's life. She diligently went through all of the court records, and she has written brilliantly and extensively on Alison's life. So Professor Ewan suspects that perhaps Alison was suing Margaret Cairns for defamation because Margaret was perhaps spreading rumours of infidelity, and of course that was something that would really damage the reputation of a woman in the early 16th century. But it was the final legal battles of Alison's life, again sadly interfamilial, that would lead to her untimely end. Her younger daughter Catherine, who, like many women at the time, worked as a brewster, had also inherited property from her father's estate, and her personal wealth, along with the promise of a really pretty substantial dowry from Alison, led to attracting what must have seemed to both mother and daughter as a reasonable prospective husband. Alexander Cantz had the security of several properties to his own name, as well as being a well-established merchant burgess. His wealth and status were evidently enough for them to overlook what must have been quite some age gap. He was twice widowed, with his first wedding having taken place before Catherine was even born, and a daughter from that first marriage was herself wed in her own right within months of Catherine and Alexander. At the time of their marriage, in late 1531 or perhaps early 1532, Alexander was in the process of building an extra chamber onto his main residence here at Craig's Close. Now, I mentioned earlier on that Craig's Close was one of those alleyways that was destroyed largely with the building of the city chambers on top of it in the late 18th century. Well, part of the close still exists, and it's that little alleyway that's running away down the hill behind me here. So Alexander was building this extra chamber, and perhaps this was for Alison to move into. And Professor Ewan has suggested that at this point, with all of her children either now married or safely within the confines of the church, perhaps Alison had decided to retire and live off the income from her property rentals. By 1535, however, Alexander was getting impatient that the dowry that he was expecting from Alison had not yet been paid. Perhaps she was slowing paying due to the ongoing situation with the son John. But whatever the reason, it turns out that Alexander's wealth was largely tied up in property, and he desperately needed the 400 merks that he believed that he was due from Alison. So he sued her. And at the same time, another property dispute, also slightly more indirectly connected with Alexander, raised its head too. And after a tense day at court, on the 30th of August, 1535, the three of them returned home for what was to be the last time here to Craig's Close. When they got back home, it seems they were unable to leave their quarrel in court. And as anger got raised to murderous levels, Catherine, Alison, and a female servant beat Alexander to death with a pair of fire tongs. Mother and daughter fled, but they were caught and apprehended just days later on the 2nd of September. Justice was swift, and they were found guilty the same day and sentenced to be executed the next. On the 3rd of September 1535, Alison Rough was put to death by drowning in the Nor Loch, a body of water that once occupied the site of Princess Street Gardens, just behind me here. Catherine, at least, escaped this fate. She was pregnant at the time and given a stay of execution until the baby arrived. She was put under house arrest, watched over by one of her brothers. Perhaps this was John, atoning for earlier family disruptions. The brother colluded, and when the child arrived, helped Catherine to escape, whilst he kept hold of the baby. Catherine fled to England, where she married a Scottish Protestant exile, Alexander Allen, and 30 years later, they moved to Germany. In a final twist of fate, the very property that had been the subject of so much angst was eventually handed over to that young daughter who had been left behind. I just hope that that young woman grew up hearing inspiring stories about her grandmother, of her great intelligence, her chutzpah, and of course her fierce family loyalty, although ultimately it was for that she would both kill and die. Well, thank you once again for watching. See you next time.